there will be a first part, and after the first part, there's room for a few questions. Then there will be a second part, and then for those of you who still have questions, you can ask them after the second part. Yeah, I think I mentioned sitting, so good luck.
Another thing I'd like to mention, if you like this talk, we are looking for new members, so please join us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Robert, for this introduction. So, as a start, Professor de Waal, could you maybe introduce yourself a bit more and tell us about your scientific background?
Yeah, in English, yes, in English. Yeah. I'm a biologist. I was trained in, sometimes in the US, I say in the majority of Dutch universities, in Nijmegen, Groningen, and Utrecht. At the time, there were only 5. Now, I believe there are 20 or something. At the time, and I got my PhD in Utrecht, working with primates already at the time. And ever since, I've worked mostly with primates, a little bit with elephants and some other species. But I moved to the United States in 1981. And I've stayed there since, and I'm still live and still work in the United States. And so I come to the Netherlands occasionally. I teach also sometimes in Utrecht. I'm a distinguished professor in Utrecht. And I'm often here in the Netherlands, but I live in the United States and do my work there.
And what would you say that your main research focuses on?
My research has always focused on cognition and emotions and social behavior of the primates. And so it started with my work in the Arnhem Zoo with the chimpanzees, which is a unique colony that was founded in the 1970s and is still unique and is still the largest chimp colony in the world. And so I started there mostly observing primates. And when I moved to the US, also in the beginning, mostly observing, just watching the social behavior in a group of like 25 or sometimes 100 primates. And later I became more experimental. I started doing behavioral experiments, non-invasive behavioral experiments, mostly on cognition, because cognition is very hard to see, to deduce just from social behavior. You have to sometimes subject the animals to controlled conditions. And so I started to do that later more, but my main work has always been observation.
If I'm not mistaken, a lot of primate research focuses on very violent parts of their behavior, but based on your book, I think your research is an exception. You like to focus on the more positive parts of primate society.
Yeah, I think that focus has changed. When I was a student, the most popular book was Konrad Lorenz's On Aggression, which was on the aggressive instinct in humans and in animals. And as a result, all the studies of animal behavior, not just the primates, but all animals, started to focus on aggression. And aggression was the big topic. We didn't have NWO at the time, I believe, so there was not this kind of funding question, but everything went into the direction of aggressive behavior. And I was a student at the time, and I got bored by aggressive behavior in the sense that if you look at a group of primates, like chimpanzees, aggressive behavior is maybe 4% of all the activities. I mean, most of the time they're grooming and playing and walking around and sleeping. And so for me, the question became more like, how do they maintain a group life while they also have sometimes aggressive conflict? So I actually got more interested in the opposite of aggression. So how do they maintain a group life despite the conflicts that they have? So that became my focus. And nowadays, I would say aggression is not the focus anymore. If you look around in the literature on animal behavior, papers on aggression and violence, yes, of course, we still have them, but that's not the main focus of people anymore. There's a lot of focus on cooperation now, and so the focus has shifted.
Was there a specific event which you noticed which said, I don't really care about aggression anymore, I'm going to focus on something else, or was it a more gradual shift?
Well, for me, it was a particular event. So I was at the Arnhem Zoo working with the chimps, and I had discovered that they reconcile after fights, and I was very interested in that behavior. So how they kiss and embrace after fights. And now we know, at the time people thought only chimpanzees do that, but now we know that almost all social animals, dogs, dolphins, elephants, almost all have repair mechanisms after fights. But anyway, the chimpanzees did that, and I was interested in that, but not sufficiently to make it my main focus. But then in the Arnhem colony, a male chimpanzee got killed by two other males. And not only killed, he got castrated by the other two males also. And so it was a terrible, traumatic thing for the chimps and for me. And I had nightmares of it. It was a horrible bloodbath that occurred. And I decided at that time that I was probably underestimating reconciliation and conflict resolution. I was underestimating how important that was, because if it fell apart, they're going to kill each other. And at the time, people would sometimes say, well, that's because it's a zoo, and of course in the zoo you cannot get away, and that's why they kill each other. Now we have at least a dozen cases from the field, from wild chimpanzees, where a high-ranking male has been killed within the group. Between the group, we knew already that chimpanzees do that kind of stuff. So between groups, we've always known that there was a high level of violence and territoriality. But within groups now we know that that also occasionally happens. So what happened in the Arnhem Zoo was not so exceptional. Also the castration was not so exceptional, and it happened in the field too. And for me it meant that I shifted my focus. I shifted my focus to the things that keep a group together, like reconciliation, like empathy, like cooperation. So that became the focus of my research.
So then looking at this behavior, also often when people are doing animal studies, they compare it to, well, humans. And is that an important goal for primatologists, for you as well?
Well, I think most primatologists are actually interested in the primates themselves. Most. It's true for me too. But of course, for us, it's fairly easy to make the comparisons because humans are primates, and so the comparison is very obvious. And of course, we all also like to throw in evolutionary story, like this behavior must be older than humans and must have arisen among the apes, the hominids, you know. For us, these comparisons are actually fairly easy. Also in popularization. But I must say, you know, if you look, for example, at the career of Ed Wilson, you can see you can also go from ants to humans. You don't need chimpanzees for that. So the comparisons between animals and humans are always made. And I think they're always useful to make, because humans are animals. Humans sometimes forget that, but humans are animals, of course.
Do you think this is disproportionately done more for chimps, for primates in general, than other animals?
The comparison with humans?
Yes.
Yeah, the closest relatives of humans are chimpanzees and bonobos. And so all the other primates are a bit more distant. So for example, genetically speaking, the difference between an orangutan and a chimpanzee is much greater than between a chimpanzee and a human. People forget that sometimes. But we are actually so close to chimpanzees and bonobos that it's a bit like African and Asian elephants. So we call them both elephants. So I feel also we need to call humans apes, basically, because we are very close to them. So that's genetically, and you may, of course, argue that intellectually we are quite different, but the more we learn about the great apes, the more holes are in that story. So I think the comparison with chimps and bonobos is absolutely essential. But people often forget the bonobo. There's no reason for that. The bonobo is exactly equally close genetically to us as the chimpanzees, so there's no reason to push them out of the picture, but that is sometimes done, and that's mostly done, I would say by anthropologists who don't like the bonobo implications, because bonobos are female dominated, they're not very violent, they're not very territorial, and some anthropologists are not happy with a close relative who is like that.
Yeah, because I can imagine that because primates, and especially chimpanzees and bonobos, they form a bit of a mirror to humans. But can that be a big issue? As you said, some anthropologists don't like some things they do. Is this a big issue in primatology? Is there this big bias, or do most primatologists handle the data pretty well?
Well, I think the primatologists in general, they don't have so much trouble with that. So for the primatologists, the bonobo is a very interesting species, and there's actually increasing research on the bonobo. So no, I think it's for people who have a story of human evolution that is based on violence. You know, the most of the stories on human evolution is that we got as far as we did by eliminating others. We eliminated the Neanderthals, we eliminated everybody else. We are territorial, we have warfare, which unites our groups and is an important source of social organization. And so that's the story. The story of human evolution still very often is a story of violence. And the bonobo doesn't fit. The bonobo is not violent. And until now, we have no cases of one bonobo killing another. So they are much happier with the chimpanzee than with the bonobo. And that kind of preferences, I think, have happened in the past. Of course, people used to compare with baboons. There was also a favorite comparison at some point 50 years ago. So yeah, people sometimes select their comparisons based on their outlook, and I think among the primatologists themselves, the bias is much less. We are interested in all sorts of species and all sorts of social arrangements.
Because what makes, because you mentioned some traits of the bonobo, but what makes the bonobo so interesting compared to the chimp?
Well, bonobos are female dominated, and their dominance is collective female dominance. So individual, the females cannot dominate the males because they're bigger and stronger and have bigger teeth. But the females have a sisterhood, which is not based on kinship, by the way. It's a sisterhood in the sense of solidarity, a high level of solidarity among the females. And the females travel together. In the wild, they call each other when they build nests in the trees so that they are within hearing range of each other. They stick together, and they have a sort of Me Too movement, I would say, of high level of solidarity among them, and that's how they curb male violence. I think it's actually the main goal why they do that is that they have put a stop to infanticide by males and to high levels of aggression by males. And similar tendencies you can sometimes see in chimpanzees, even though in chimpanzees they live more dispersed over the forest usually, and the females have more trouble recruiting each other. But in captivity, for example, in the Arnhem colony, for example, the females were a very important power block led by the alpha female. And so in chimpanzees, in captivity where they're all together, the females can have a high level of solidarity too. So I think it's a tendency that we see in our two close relatives. In the bonobo, it has worked out to be female dominance. In chimpanzees, in some communities, especially in West Africa, we see a high level of female solidarity too. So I think the bonobo is interesting for that reason, because of this high level of female solidarity. And the other one is erotic, is that they have a lot of sexual behavior. The females also service their relationships by having a lot of sex with each other. There's a lot of homosexual behavior. I usually call bonobos bisexual in the sense that I'm not sure they have a preference for one sex or the other. So the bonobo is erotically extremely interesting. And this is sometimes also held against them because the TV programs of the BBC and the NHK, they don't know what to do with a very sexy species. And so they avoid them, and I sometimes ask them, why are there so few documentaries on the bonobos and so many on the chimpanzees? And they say, well, with chimpanzees you can expect action, And what they mean is violence and fights and stuff like that. And, they know what to do with that, but there's a lot of action in the bonobos, but it's a different kind of action. So they have trouble with that, especially American and British filmmakers are, of course, affected by the Puritanism that exists in these countries, and so they have trouble with that. I think it is changing. I know of a lot of interest now in bonobos, and people are going to film more bonobos in the field, I think. But until now, what you have seen on TV is probably all chimpanzee stuff.
And then how can we try to get this view on bonobos, for example, more well known? How can we do that?
Well, I've been working for 30 years to get them more known, and they used to be called dwarf chimpanzees in Dutch, Dwarf Chimpanzees or pygmy chimpanzees, which didn't help. So the name didn't help because people thought they were just small chimpanzees, but they are really totally different. So I think the way to make them know is talk about them or write about them and have TV programs on them. And I think that's going to happen. It's going to happen.
We'll talk more about the bonobos in the next section. We will now be opening, be given room for questions from the audience. The mic is with Robert.
One question in the front.
Hi, hello. Thank you so much for your talk up until now. I was wondering if you know any theories on why the bonobos have a female-dominated society instead of male dominance like the chimpanzees, while they're so closely related.
Yeah, there are a few ecological theories about why bonobos are more cohesive in their group life, because that's really what makes it possible for them to be that way. I'm not sure how strongly supported these theories are, but one of the ideas of Richard Wrangham and people who are more ecologically oriented than me is that the bonobo lives in a rich environment with a lot of food, and they have no competition from gorillas, because the gorillas don't live in their area, who eat a lot of ground vegetation. And so as opposed to the chimpanzee, they have the ability to travel together in that environment. There's enough food for them to travel together as a group, whereas chimpanzees often live in environments where they need to spread out in order to get enough food, because otherwise there's too much competition between them. So that's one of the theories that still doesn't explain why they are more peaceful and why they are female-dominated, and why they use more sexual activities than the chimpanzee. And it is possible that that what the bonobo females have done is find a solution to infanticide, which is an issue in many primates and many animals actually. Infanticide occurs, and to put a stop to it by a high level of solidarity and self-protection, basically.
Thank you so much.
Is there room for one more question, or yeah, one more question?
Hi, thanks for your talk so far. As more of a question for you in your research life, do you still have the same fascination working with primates now as you had, say, like when you first started out?
Yes, I think we've only scratched the surface of primate behavior and primate cognition. You know, if you look at how many people study humans, the human species is, if you have at least like a couple of million, maybe 3-4 million scientists who devote their attention to human psychology and human cognition and so on, neuroscience, whatever. If you bring experts on apes together, you may get 500 people. So it's totally disproportional. I think we're only scratching the surface. And the more we learn about the great apes, the more we realize that many of the things that have been claimed to be uniquely human are also found in them. This has happened over my career constantly, is that some scientists take out the position and they say only humans have theory of mind, or only humans can plan ahead, or only humans are conscious of the past. Or these claims have always come, and 5 years later they had to be dropped, and then the new claim comes because the humans have a strong desire to have a claim for uniqueness, and that needs to come from somewhere. And over time, they've all dropped by the wayside. And I'm not personally sure, except for language, is the one capacity that I would make an exception for. But except for that, I'm not sure that there are uniquely human cognitive capacities. And so we keep working on that, but it's very tough to work with primates like chimpanzees or bonobos. In captivity, it's very hard to do the experiment. In the wild, it's very hard to follow them. And since in the wild you usually cannot do controlled experiments, it's very hard to get the information that you need. And then in addition to neuroscience, I'm very opposed to invasive neuroscience on the primates. It used to be that people would scoop out a part of the brain and see how they would do, which I think is a very primitive method of doing neuroscience. And so I'm waiting for the time that we can do non-invasive neuroscience on them, which is going to happen as we do in humans. There are already labs at Emory. There's a lab that trains dogs to be in the scanner, and they can sit still for about 3 minutes or so, which is not just long enough to do a test on them. And it's going to happen with the primates. I know that there are some labs now trying to train primates on sitting still on the scanner. And once we get non-invasive neuroscience, there's a whole range of other questions that we can ask.
Thank you. That will be the final question for now. We'll now be moving to our second part of the talk.
Yes, you describe yourself as a feminist. Could you elaborate on this point, and how does this influence you write in your book?
Yeah, what I mean by being a feminist is that I'm for equality between the genders, in the sense that my background is actually interesting in that regard. I'm from a family of 6 boys, no girls. So I'm from a family that consisted of 7 men and 1 woman. And maybe as a result, I was very curious about gender. And at some point, I even joined as a student a feminist movement until they became hostile to men, which I didn't appreciate. So I'm interested in that issue. And the reason I wrote this book on gender is because each time I give lectures, before the COVID crisis, I gave many lectures on animal cognition, animal emotions, consciousness, things like that. Each time I would mention gender differences in the primates, and I would say females are more empathic than males. I did a lot of research on empathy, and this is generally true for the primates, or that males are more violent, physically violent than females. Each time I would mention that, there would be many questions from the audience. And so I noticed that there was a great curiosity about sex differences. And that curiosity, I think, comes from the fact that on the internet and in the newspapers, what people read is that gender differences are cultural. Most gender differences are made up by society, and they could be removed if you wanted to. And I think the general audience, maybe the academics accept that, but the general audience is very skeptical about that. And so that's why they want to hear from a biologist what he thinks about that. And even if they disagree with me, because it's very well possible that, because it's a very difficult topic, that they disagree with me, there's an enormous curiosity about the biology of gender. And I think in society, we're not doing a good job to talk about biology of gender. We try to poo-poo it and to remove it and to raise our children gender neutral because we think we can do away with it. And for me, that's the wrong approach. Then the problem of gender inequality is not, of those 2 words, it's not the gender that's the problem, it's the inequality. To me, that's the problem. And so you have to work on the inequality part and trying to solve it by eliminating gender or diminishing it or poo-pooing it. Is probably not the way you're going to handle that issue. That doesn't mean that gender is not an issue. In biology, of course, we're very used to sex, biological sex, which is the body, basically, your brain, your hormones, your chromosomes, your genitals. That's the biological sex. But gender is a useful concept because humans are very slowly developing. We're adults when we're 18. We learn an enormous amount of things during our lifetime. We're very influenced by the social roles and the expectations and how you have to behave as a man and as a woman. So gender is a very useful concept to stress the environmental inputs. And so I'm not against a discussion of gender in general, but it needs to include biology because that's a sort of misunderstanding. People sometimes say, this is purely cultural. There are no things that are purely cultural. Humans are organisms that have bodies, and so we cannot be purely cultural. There's always biology in everything we do. And there's also no pure biology. It doesn't exist, pure biology. Pure biology would be what? I don't know. Every organism grows up in an environment and has inputs from the environment. So pure biology doesn't exist either. And I think in the primates we have, of course, also genders, because a chimpanzee or bonobo is adult when they're 16 years old. They nurse for 5 years. I mean, they're very slow, almost as slow as we are, and so they learn also an enormous amount of things in their lifetime. And so gender is a useful concept, not just for humans, but also for some other species that are slow in their development. And so I wanted to write about that because I noticed that people are curious about the biology of gender and are hesitant to talk about it. There's many academics, especially in psychology, who avoid the topic. And I think that is a sort of shyness born from the fear of controversy. And I'm not afraid of controversy. I don't think that's a big issue.
So then, what is in your eyes the relation between sex and gender?
Well, they're never independent. So that's an idea is that some people have, is that you can separate gender from sex. The reason we have a gender duality is because we have two sexes. And even though the picture is complex, so even for sex, biological sex, the picture is complex. We know that, for example, that there are intersexual individuals. In animals, we usually call them hermaphrodites. In humans, we call them intersex individuals. There's like 1 or 2%, it depends on how you define it, of individuals who don't easily fit as a male, as a female. They have, for example, different chromosomes, different hormone profiles, different genitals, or genitals of both sexes. So yes, that's in humans. So even sex is not simple. And in the primates, it's fairly simple, but there's other groups of animals like fish, which is really complex. And gender is definitely not so simple because gender I usually don't divide in male and female. I divide in masculine and feminine and everything in between. And gender is a much more complex concept, and it's not simple either. So they remain always connected, I think, at some level. And certainly at the level of gender identity. You're born with a gender identity. And how that's filled in is dependent on your environment. So they remain always connected, but gender is a much more fluid concept and much more changeable, I would say. The gender expression is much more changeable than sex.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's a certain fluidity to gender in humans, but is this also the case in primates? I know in the book you mentioned Donna as an example.
Yeah. Yeah, I had not realized when I started writing the book that I actually knew quite a few, because I know so many individual primates, I know quite a few individuals who don't fit the easy gender division. And in addition, of course, homosexual behavior is extremely common. So the homosexual behavior, that has been known for about 20 years or more, that we find that in other species. And in some species, like the bonobo, it's extremely common. In other species, it's maybe a minority of the sexual encounters, but still. in all species, you're going to find some homosexual behavior. So the gender diversity that you see, apart from that, the homosexual behavior, is also that you have individuals who don't fit the typical roles. And I think it's maybe 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 individuals, and we don't have data on that because, like society, the primatologists have been looking mostly at typical behavior. We like the typical male and the typical female, and we have ignored sort of the rest. You mentioned Donna. Donna is a female chimpanzee that I knew since she was 3 years old, so a little baby. And she already at that age, she wanted to wrestle with me, and she wanted to wrestle with the adult male chimpanzees, and something that young females don't often do. Young males are into wrestling, but not the females so much, which is, by the way, also a universal human gender difference between children, is that boys do much more rough and tumble play than girls. And so Donna was exceptional in that. And the male chimpanzees accepted that from her, and they wrestled with her. And when she grew older, she grew into a male-like character. She grew the big shoulders and the big hair and the big head. And she started walking like a male, and she associated with the males. She hung out with them all the time. She acted like a male, and she, from a distance, she looked like a male. And she did very well in the group, and this is another thing is that I find interesting is that all these individuals that I know, I've also known quite a few male primates who are big and strong and could be maybe high ranking, but they're not interested in the competition. They stay out of all this male politicking that is going on and status struggles. And so you have individuals who deviate from the norm in their behavior. And what I find interesting is that they're all very well accepted. I've never actually noticed that individuals who are more homosexual than heterosexual, or individuals who deviate, like Donna, from typical behavior, I've never noticed that they are in trouble. So the intolerance, I live in the US and I see intolerance to the trans community the whole day, basically. The intolerance is something typically human, I think. And maybe it has to do with our tendency to label. We love to put labels on everything. The LGBTQ, that's all labeling business. So we're into labeling, and we are very normative. We have norms of how you ought to behave. And they shift, of course, over time and with culture. But still, we have these norms. And in the other primates, I've never noticed that this is a big issue. And so that's the positive side, actually, is that in their case, they just take others as they come, so to speak, and they don't worry about it.
Thank you. So you mentioned cultures, and that in primates, obviously also have a culture, right?
Yeah.
Could you maybe give an example of where this cultural difference is observed? I think earlier in the talk you mentioned East versus West Africa. I think you're referring to the chimpanzee colonies.
Yeah. Well, culture is a concept that is increasingly used in the primates because they learn from each other. And so you can actually, by the behavior alone, you can distinguish chimpanzees from this region from chimpanzees in that region, as you can do with human behavior. But of course, in humans, culture is enormously elaborate. But in all the other primates, we find culture. And to relate to the gender issue, in human children generally they adopt an adult of their own gender as their model. For girls, it may be their mother. For boys, it may be their father. It may also be characters in the animated movies that they see, such as princesses and princes and things like that. So we look for models of our own sex. And for transgender children, it is often models of the opposite sex. So it's a child is born as a little boy, but then starts to emulate women and follow them around and follow their example. This